All right, guys, let's talk about the Federalist era. So, first thing, something confusing because that's pretty much all of history. We talked last time about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, right? Well, now we're going to talk about the Federalist era. Something that it's really important for you to remember. The Federalists that we talk about during the Federalist era are not the same dudes as the Federalists from the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists weren't political parties. They were two different sides of an argument, and we gave them a name. We called them Federalists because they believed in a strong central government with the passage of the Constitution. All right, these Federalists are going to be similar. They're going to believe very much in a very strong central government, but they're different dudes, okay? Very, very important distinction for you to make. All right, so first thing I want to talk about is the Bill of Rights. All right, so we're going to go back to those Federalists and Anti-Federalists for a minute, just to confuse you a little. So the Anti-Federalists, remember, one of their big things was if we're going to have a constitution, we have to have a Bill of Rights. We have to protect individuals' rights if you're going to have a stronger central government. Now, in fairness to the Anti-Federalists, even with the Bill of Rights, a lot of our Supreme Court cases today are about what rights we have, what's included in this Bill of Rights, whether certain things are an infringement of our rights. So even with this Bill of Rights, it's kind of dicey. Imagine not having one. All right, so the Anti-Federalists were pretty spot on with this one. But one thing that I want you guys to understand, history is all about making connections. I'm not going to make you guys memorize the Bill of Rights. You might have to do that in a political science class or something like that, but for us, we're making connections. You guys are going to make connections between the Bill of Rights and things that are happening today. I'm going to make connections for you now between the Bill of Rights and things that were happening before, because this Bill of Rights, it wasn't created in a vacuum. It reflects the fears and the tension of the time in which it was created. So it reflects the things that were happening before it was written. All right. So our First Amendment, we've got the freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly, petition. This is the one that is the most commonly known, the most commonly quoted. This is the one that says that you can say what you want to say, that you can stand up and you can protest, that you can write what you want, whether it's stupid or not, you can write your Facebook comments, and you have the freedom to do that, right? But one thing that's really important to remember, and one thing that we see a lot with the First Amendment here, is your freedoms end where they begin to infringe on other people. You're free to do these things, but you're not free from the consequences of your actions, okay? It's really important for you to remember. The next one I want to talk about, the Second Amendment, all right? This is the one that is perhaps the most hotly contested right now, and pretty much, at least at the very least in my lifetime, it's been a hot button issue. All right, the Second Amendment protects our right to bear arms for a well-regulated militia. All right, so there are a lot of questions that come with this, because remember, you're free to choose but not free from the consequences, and your freedoms stop where they infringe on other people's. So is you having access to an assault rifle an infringement on other people's freedoms because you could take that gun and go shoot up a movie theater? Is it okay to run background checks or to run mental health checks and limit who can have guns because they could possibly be a danger to society? These are questions that we're struggling with right now, and they're ones that don't really have a clear-cut answer. This is also one of those amendments, one of those freedoms where people on both sides have some really good points, you guys. And what I want you to learn, what I want you to get from this class is that you don't have to agree with someone to understand their opinion and to even think that their opinion is valid. Okay? As an adult, as a functioning member of society, you will be far better off if you can have a rational discussion without getting angry and without putting down someone else's opinion. I think that That is one of the most important things that we as a society, as college students, as people can learn and understand. All right. And it's really, really evident in our argument about the Second Amendment. Because here's the thing, you guys, nobody is arguing, hey, we should all have guns and we should shoot people with them that don't deserve it. Nobody who agrees with guns and nobody who disagrees with guns is saying we should shoot innocent people. Right? We have that in common. We don't think you should do that at all. And so this is a really good example of one of those topics where you can have strong feelings about it, but you can also listen, you can also change your opinion, and you can accept other people's opinions and the validity of their arguments, right? So I'll get off my little soapbox there. And now I want to move and talk about the Third Amendment, because this one is one of those that you look at it and you're kind of like, why did our founding fathers decide that we needed to stick this in here? It's kind of weird, right? There are a couple of them that you're like, what? Why did we decide? But this one especially, like, why did we decide to stick this one in here? It's like a Pokemon, you guys. It's like Mewtwo. You guys know who Mewtwo is? Like, there's just one of that guy. So he's super rare. You're not really going to run into him until the wild. But what if one day you do? And so that's kind of what the Third Amendment is all about. The Third Amendment was written at a time where we were still thinking about the American Revolution, where we were still thinking about how Britain was quartering British soldiers with colonists when we technically weren't at war. Remember Boston Massacre and all that, right? It made a surprise little Pokemon appearance, you guys, not too long ago. There were protests. The National Guard was sent in. They were being housed at, I think it was a hotel, if I remember right. And they were asked to leave, and people were like, you can't kick the military out. And the people who did the kicking out were like, actually, there's an entire amendment that says that we can. Now, I don't care if you agree with that or not. Okay, I don't care if you were one of the ones that was like, we shouldn't kick them out, if you were one of the ones that we should. Either way, what you need to understand is our founding fathers stuck that in there because they were worried that it would happen again. And it was peacetime, and people were being housed somewhere, and they got kicked out because of this Third Amendment, right? Then we've got the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment is really, really, really important, you guys, because it's one of those things that really separates us from a police state, all right? The Fourth Amendment, they all say a bunch of stuff. So this is just kind of gisting it. They say that you can't have police and people like that. They can't do unreasonable searches, and that searches require warrants. They require probable cause. All right, so where did this come from? You guys remember those writs of assistance? That's where we got this. You had the British coming in and they were harassing colonial shippers, and there wasn't really a reason for it. So we stuck it in here. Hey, you have to have a reason to bother somebody, to search them. This is the amendment that says if a police officer comes up to your car and they're like, hey buddy, let me look in your trunk, unless you have somebody who is like screaming from your trunk, that gives them probable cause, trust me, or they have a search warrant, you technically have the right, the freedom to say, no, I don't think I want you to today. A lot of people don't really understand that. Now, there's a difference between whether you should necessarily do that, and that's something that we're not going to get into because that's more of a contemporary issue and it's a whole conversation. But you have the right to say, no, you don't have a search warrant, you don't have probable cause, you're not looking in my trunk, or you're not coming into my house. All right, these next amendments, the 5th through 8th one, I told you guys, I'm not going to make you like memorize all of these. And so these, I like to call these amendments court stuff. They all have to do with court. They all have to do with getting a fair trial, due process of law, stuff like that. All right, so it has to do with you can't be tried for the same crime twice. That's the 5th Amendment. So I don't know if any of you guys are old enough to remember O.J. Simpson. That was a huge trial. I think it was in like 4th grade. And no, first grade. I was making myself older than I am. I was like first grade. O.J. Simpson was tried for the murder of his wife, and his lawyer was like, if the glove does not fit, you must acquit. And after the trial was over, no, I'm not saying that OJ was guilty. Just in case our good friend OJ Simpson listens to my lectures, I don't know why you would, but just in case, like, I'm not saying you're guilty, man. But he did come out with a book later on. Have you guys read this? Have you looked at it? It's a book that's basically like, I'm not saying that I murdered her, but if I did, this is how I did it. And he can't be tried again. He could literally come out and say, hey, yeah, by the way, murdered her, and we can't try him again for murder. Okay, that's double jeopardy. You've also got the right to a speedy and public trial, the right to a trial by jury, the right to be free from excessive bail or fines, things like that. That's all setting up our court system, because we knew that that was going to be a big thing. We've also got here the 9th and 10th Amendments. So the 9th Amendment, essentially, it's called the People's Rights Amendment. It essentially protects other rights that haven't necessarily been outright stated. Okay, so just because it's not stated here doesn't mean that you don't have that right. And then you've got the 10th Amendment that says the unlisted powers belong to the state. This is the States' Rights Amendment. All right. The 9th Amendment was written primarily for the Federalists. Remember, those guys thought that we didn't need a Bill of Rights because it was just ultimately going to take away rights if you had to have your rights listed and we forgot something, so they wanted to include this one. The Anti-Federalists wanted the States' Rights Amendment that basically says if it's not given to that central power, the states still control it. All right, so we finally have a president, you guys. George Washington. Remember him from the French Indian War, from the American Revolution? He's been doing the most. He's still around. Washington was unanimously elected by the Electoral College in 1789. That is the only time that has ever happened. And his presidency was characterized by cordial foreign relations. We were nice to people outside of the United States, but we also wanted to stay kind of neutral in conflict. We were a tiny little baby country, so we didn't want to get involved. He also set a bunch of precedents for the new nation. Additionally, honestly, you guys, this slide is just because I love George Washington memes. But he also believed that divergent views were critical for the health of the new government. All right, so now we have a tendency to see everything in a very diametrically opposed kind of way, right? We look at things as Republican versus Democrat, and if a Republican thinks it and we're a Democrat, we think the exact opposite, kind of just on principle, you guys. Washington thought that you needed all of those views, you needed to put them together, and you needed to come to a good compromise. He was a big believer in compromise, and that was most of what the Constitution was as well. We've kind of gotten away from that idea of compromise, but our boy George Washington thinks that's what we need to make our government strong. And in keeping with that, Washington set up the very first cabinet. All right, so the members of his cabinet, major ones, you've got Henry Knox. He was the Secretary of War. The Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson, and the Secretary of the Treasury was Alexander Hamilton. All right, Hamilton has a whole entire musical based on him. Okay, all right, so we got T. Jeff and Hammy. That's what I've decided because we're good friends, so that's what I've decided that I call them. These guys disagreed with each other on pretty much everything, you guys. And so Washington thought that would be really, really good for the country. And if they had come to compromises, sure, would have been excellent. But instead, they fought. Jefferson believed in something called strict construction. It was a constitutional interpretation. He thought that if the Constitution doesn't say that you can do something, you can't do it. Hamilton was a loose constructionist, which is the exact opposite. He basically thought that if the Constitution doesn't say you can't do it, if it's not forbidden, it's probably cool, go ahead and do it. That was their biggest divide. Jefferson also believed that the agrarian nation was our future, that farms, farm holders, especially small farmers, were the future of the nation. And Hamilton thought that the factory system would win out over farming, so we should invest in that. Now, ultimately, Hamilton was right in this respect. The first industrial revolution is going to play a huge role in this, and we're going to move toward industry. Jefferson thought that power should be left primarily in the hands of the state, while Hamilton thought that power should be from the top down with the federal government in charge. And that's kind of the way that we're going to end up leaning. But these guys are going to clash so much that they end up forming our two first political parties, which we'll talk about in a second. Before we talk about that, though, I want to talk about Hamilton's financial plan. Because remember, Hamilton was the Secretary of the Treasury. So he's going to favor two main things. He's going to favor the wealthy, and he's going to favor a factory system. All right, so in favoring the wealthy, he believes in something called trickle-down economics. So the basics of trickle-down economics. You can't really see my stick figure, but all right, so here's our rich dude. Right? The idea of trickle-down economics is that you have the rich and you have businesses, and if you give them subsidies and tax breaks and things like that, all that money is going to literally trickle down to the poor. Okay? It is something that works in theory, but usually not so much in practice. He also is going to try to ensure the financial health of our nation in this financial system. The financial system can be broken into four main aspects. I have broken it into, this is very common, so don't think that I made this up. I'm not that creative. But I've broken it up into the facts of the financial plan. All right. So F is funding at par. Essentially, and we're just going to gist this, you guys, so you have an idea of what these are. Essentially, funding at par is the nation's credit worthiness. So it's kind of like our credit score. All right. So if you have a terrible credit score and you go and you try to buy a house or you try to buy a car, nobody's going to give you any credit, right? We need a good credit score for the nation. The A stands for assuming state debts. Essentially what he wants to do is take on the state debts from the American Revolution and create a national debt. He believed that a national debt was critical for our economy. Because usually if somebody owes you money, you're not going to become enemies with them as long as they're paying you back, right? You're not going to blow up a country or stop talking to somebody that owes you 20 bucks if they're paying you $1 every month, right? So that's what he thinks. He thinks that this is going to actually ensure our health. We'll have good relations with the countries that we owe money. He also wants to create a national bank, which would create a common currency. This one is huge, you guys. This is the one that T-Jeff and Hammy disagree on the most, which is funny because later on, Jeffersonians, people who support Thomas Jefferson, are going to create the second national bank. But this is the first national bank, all right? And the T stands for excise taxes and tariffs. Both of these are going to be used to raise revenue. They're going to be used to pay our nation's bills. Because remember, one of the problems with the Articles of Confederation is we didn't have a way to make money. Now we do. All right, so now that my boy Hammy has his financial plan in place, one of the big things that we're going to see impacting regular everyday people is the excise tax. The excise tax is the best parallel to draw is it's kind of like a sales tax. So the people who are selling have to pay this tax, and it's gonna be pretty hard for especially those small town farmers. All right. This is the first test of our constitutional government. You guys remember when we talked about Shays' Rebellion, you get people saying, hey, the Articles of Confederation aren't doing enough. We can't go in and put down this rebellion, right? Well, now we get another chance at it. Now that we have a constitution, we have to see if the constitution works. So Pennsylvania backcountry farmers are hit especially hard by this excise tax. They start torching buildings, they tar and feather revenue officers, they talk about secession. Seems pretty ridiculous, right? But one thing that you have to understand, these things, we talked about this with the American Revolution, right? And during the American Revolution, we were like, yeah, do it. Sam Adams was gung-ho. He was like, let's tar and feather some people. But now that it's our government, it's not okay anymore. And so we are going to quickly put down this rebellion. Tax collections come to a halt, you guys, with this rebellion, and Washington has to make a decisive move. He has to show that the Constitution works, because if he doesn't, this whole thing could fall apart. Right? We could have not had, y'all could have not had to take this class. We could have not had these next couple hundred years of American history. But instead, what happens is Washington summons a militia of about 13,000. He goes hard, you guys. 13,000 men to put down this rebellion. He is going to even march about half of the way with them. Alexander Hamilton's going to do some marching as well. And in putting down this rebellion, he shows that he can ensure domestic peace, that the Constitution works. So out of all of this, you guys, comes a big divide with our first party system, right? So Alexander Hamilton believes in loose construction, in the power of the federal government. Thomas Jefferson believes in strict construction. He believes that we should leave things mostly to the state. And so now we divide ourselves into the first two political parties. We've got the Federalists and we've got the Democratic Republicans. All right, so our friend Hamilton is going to be the head of the Federalists, and Jefferson is in charge of the Democratic Republicans. And so, like I said, these Federalists are different than the Federalists from the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. They believe in some similar stuff. They believe in rule by the upper class, a strong central government with a loose interpretation of the Constitution. They are also pro-British. The Democratic Republicans, on the other hand, pretty much the exact opposite. They believe in the rule of the people. They mostly have middle or lower classes supporting them. They believe in states' rights and a strict construction interpretation of the Constitution, and they're pro-French. All right, so let's switch gears just a little bit and talk about the French Revolution. Now, the French Revolution, remember, we just talked about the two political parties. The Federalists were pro-British, the Democratic Republicans were pro-French. We are in the Federalist era, meaning that the Federalists are pretty much running the show, right? So that's where we get our stance on the French Revolution. This becomes the most important issue separating the emerging political parties, because remember, we wanted to stay kind of neutral in this stuff, but the French Revolution was huge. And at first, we were kind of excited. Now, the French Revolution is crazy town banana pants. You guys, there's a lot going on in the French Revolution. There are a few phases of it. Starts out pretty similar to the American Revolution. You've got people rebelling, being like, hey, let's have a democracy. And so at first we're excited. We're like, yeah, we sparked a bunch of revolutions and there's going to be democracy and it's going to be great. Then the revolution is won-ish, and this guy takes over. His name's Robespierre, and he begins a reign of terror where he just kind of goes insane and goes a little bit too far on the opposite end of the spectrum. This is why I argue that the Articles of Confederation, even though they didn't work, it was a very important period in American history. It was almost like a cooling down period so that we didn't go too far in the opposite direction after the American Revolution. That's what really happens with the French Revolution. The revolution is sort of won by these guys. Robespierre takes control and he starts literally chopping off people's heads with guillotines, you guys. And so that's known as the Reign of Terror. That's another wave of the French Revolution. And so we start to get a little bit iffy here. We're like, what is happening? And the French Revolution snowballs until it's more or less a world war, where you have Britain and France and other world powers all involved trying to figure out what's going on. Napoleon is going to take over during this time period. You guys might have heard of him. He's supposedly really short. He's really not that short. But he takes over France. We're going to issue in 1793 the Neutrality Proclamation. And that literally just says, hey, we're out of this. We announced neutrality between Britain and France. This is really awkward, though, because the Americans had an alliance with the French during the American Revolution, and it said that we would ally with them until there was peace. And we didn't really specify our peace, so we're technically still supposed to be on the French's side. They take it with a grain of salt, though. They're like, we understand you don't want to get involved in our drama, and so they allow us to kind of get away with that neutrality. So a couple of big things are going to happen during this time period. One of those is Jay's treaties. So even though we're trying to be really cordial, we're trying to not get involved in stuff, there's going to be a lot of tension between the United States and other major world powers. So the British specifically, we're going to have some issues with. We signed the Treaty of Paris, but we didn't really have very much closure. And the British were continuing to do a lot of the things that they weren't supposed to do. Now, in fairness, so were we. But we have some issues. The British were active on the northern frontier in North America, violating their peace treaty. They were also impressing sailors and forcing them into service on British vessels. Now, impressing sailors does not mean that they were like juggling and it was very impressive. It means that they are literally pressing them, forcing them into service. The Federalists were unwilling to go to war. Remember, they're pro-British. And so John Jay, who's also the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, is going to negotiate this treaty. And in it, it says that the British would remove their posts from U.S. soil and pay for damages for seizures of U.S. ships. And the United States, in return, agreed to pay their pre-revolution debts. Here's the problem. The British removing their posts from U.S. soil and the U.S. agreeing to pay their pre-revolution debts, basically almost all of the provisions of the treaty, those were literally included in the Treaty of Paris, and we just hadn't done them. And so for that reason, Jay's Treaty really only calms tensions between the British and the United States. It doesn't really do that much. The British are going to refuse to guarantee against future impressment or inciting Native American violence. So the big problem, the northern frontier activity and the impressing sailors, they refused to say that they wouldn't do that. It did avoid war with Britain, but it also avoided our issues. We just kind of don't talk about it. Now, I told you guys, it's not just tensions with the British. There's also going to be some big tensions with the Spanish, with the French. The Pinckney Treaty is going to deal specifically with the Spanish. It's going to normalize relations with Spain. Spain was really worried about an Anglo-American alliance, specifically with Britain, but they were also kind of worried that we would ally with France, and so they wanted to make sure that we were on good terms. Because the Spanish, their power, both in Spain and in the Americas, they were declining. So they were just kind of like, let's go ahead and just end all of this tension. Let's not fight. Let's be friends. Because, I mean, they had already seen the French messed with us when the French-Indian War. They lost a lot of their territory. The British messed with us. They lost a lot of their territory. They just want to play nice. So they're going to give the United States free navigation of the Mississippi River. That is hugely, hugely important because it means that we can get stuff to the ocean where it needs to go. We can ship stuff out. And it also gave us much of Florida. So our good friend George is going to leave office voluntarily after 2 terms. Basically because he was tired and he wanted to go home. I actually read this in a kid's book once. I was reading this book to my cousins, and I think they were like 4 and 5 at the time, and I was like, huh, seems weird. Is that true? And I was still in school at the time, so I went and I researched it a little bit, and yeah, Washington was basically like, guys, I'm done, bye, and he left. But before he left, he wrote a farewell address. In that farewell address, he warned against 2 things, both of which we are going to do because we don't listen, you guys. One of them was the formation of political parties, which we had already begun to do, and we have definitely definitely done today. And the other is the building of permanent foreign alliances. He says both of those things are probably going to be terrible. George was pretty prophetic. So he says, for example, in the farewell address, in contemplating the causes which may disturb our union, it occurs as a matter of serious concern that any ground should have been furnished for characterizing parties by geographical discriminations, northern and southern, Atlantic and western, whence designing men may endeavor to excite a belief that there's a real difference of local interests and views, right? So exciting a belief that there's a real difference of interests and views. Now, specifically in this, he's talking about geography. He's talking about the North and the South, or the East and the West. A little bit prophetic, you guys, because in a little while, we're going to be talking about the Civil War, where the North and the South fight each other. It is politically polarizing. It's going to be pretty much Republicans in the North and Democrats in the South. There's going to be a whole big bad breakup, and all of it is because we come up with this idea that there's a real difference between the North and the South. But you can also see it reflected in today's politics, you guys. We have people telling us all the time that there is a fundamental difference between being a Democrat and a Republican. And we have people from both of those parties telling us there's a real difference in our interests, in our views, in all of that. George Washington said that's a terrible idea. All right, so after Washington leaves office, remember he leaves voluntarily, he's going to set a precedent, and it's not going to be until Franklin D. Roosevelt in the 1930s that we see a president take more than 2 terms. We now have a law, we now have something that says you can't have more than 2 terms. FDR was the only time that happened. Before that, people kind of stuck to the 2 terms rule. So after George Washington leaves office, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams run against one another. Now you might be asking yourself, why is the Federalist candidate John Adams and not Alexander Hamilton? And this is one of the most interesting aspects, I think, of early American history, you guys, because it's the very first sex scandal. All right, so a lot of people falsely believe that Alexander Hamilton was ineligible to run for president because Alexander Hamilton was not born in America. He was born, I think, down in the Caribbean, but that wasn't why, because there was actually a caveat in the Constitution, because people at this point in time, technically, pretty much nobody that was running for office was actually born in the United States. They may have been born in the colonies, but it wasn't a United States when they were being born. So there's a little caveat in there. Alexander Hamilton was 100% eligible to run for office, to run for the presidency. He never did, though. And one of the reasons is because it was around this time that his activities during his time as Secretary of the Treasury came out. And he was actually having an affair. This is something that, if you've ever seen the Hamilton musical, supposedly it's coming to Netflix. I don't know if it has yet. I don't think it has. Like, when it does, 100% watching it. But if you've seen Hamilton or you've listened to the music, Mariah Reynolds plays a big role in the Hamilton musical, and that's the woman that Hamilton was having an affair with. And her husband figures everything out. He writes Hamilton a letter. There's, again, a song all about this. It's called "Say No to This." You should listen to it. But it's all about Hamilton's affair with Mariah Reynolds and her husband finding out and blackmailing Hamilton. And so when all of this comes out, nobody's really like, hey, you're cheating on your wife. That's very rude. Instead, everybody's like, hey, you're cheating on your wife and you're paying a bribe for this guy not to tell anybody. Were you using treasury funds to pay that bribe? And so Hamilton goes hard, you guys. Hamilton is one of those guys, love him or hate him. He was eccentric. He was great with a pen and paper. And he was kind of a no BS kind of dude. So when he gets accused of all this, he writes something called the Reynolds pamphlet, and he goes into explicit detail about this affair, about the money that he's paying, and supposedly it's to make sure that the American people know that he didn't use American funds to pay this bribe. But he kind of disgraces himself a little bit with it, with both the sex scandal and with the money scandal that comes along with it. And so John Adams ends up running for president. John Adams is related to Sam Adams, but he is far, far less pot stirrer than Sam was. He's actually, I like to think of him as kind of a blank sort of dude. He didn't really do all that much. He didn't really stand for much. He lets a lot happen, though. So he wins the election of 1796 over Thomas Jefferson. Weird thing that we fix after this, though, Jefferson becomes his vice president because that's how the Electoral College was originally set up. So that gets a little bit weird. Couple things are going to happen during his 4 years as president. He's our first one-term president. The first is the XYZ affair. The French get really mad about Jay's Treaty. They think it's a step toward an alliance, and they're like, hey, rude, you can't do that. We still have our revolutionary agreement. So we send some people to kind of make sure that France knows we're not trying to get in bed with Britain. It reminds me kind of like if like the scenarios where you have a girlfriend reading her boyfriend's text and he's like, nah, it doesn't, I know you look through my phone, but it isn't what you think it is. And he tries to smooth everything over and be like, she's just a friend. No, I was texting Dominoes. Like, y'all know what I'm talking about. So that's kind of how the XYZ affair really works. We send a delegation to Paris to try to smooth everything over. And they're trying to be like, nah, we don't want Britain, we want you. And before the delegation actually gets to talk to anybody in power, they're secretly approached by 3 French agents. They demand a large loan or bribe. And we're offended. We're like, no, you can't, we can't be bought. We're not going to pay to talk to an ambassador. No. And so they leave, they storm off. And instead, we just have a very passive-aggressive, undeclared naval war for the next 2.5 years. And that undeclared naval war wreaks havoc on Adams's presidency. He doesn't look good, you guys. He's also going to oversee the passage of a couple really shady laws. Now, something that I want you guys to understand, something that is applicable today, okay? The president does not make the law, okay? That's Congress. If a law is made and passed, Congress does it. The president signs it into law. He has 2 options. He can sign it into law or he can veto it and send it back to Congress. But ultimately, if you blame the president or commend the president for things that are passed, for laws that are put on the books, that's not the entire story. That's not the whole picture for you to look at. It's not all the president's fault, nor is it all of the president's, what's the opposite of fault? Like, he doesn't deserve all the glory for it either, right? He's not the one who did it. So, John Adams, like I said, he's just kind of blank. He just kind of lets things happen. The Federalist-controlled Congress is going to pass the Alien and Sedition laws. He signs them into law. The alien laws are going to raise residence requirements for aliens seeking citizenship, right? What that means, there was no such thing as an illegal alien at this point in time. It's not until 1920s, 30s that we start to see immigration laws being put on the books that keep people from coming to the United States. We had kind of an open borders policy until then, but you did need to become a citizen if you wanted to vote, if you wanted to participate in American politics, things like that. If you wanted to stay here, you had to do that. But you had to live here for a certain amount of time, and then you had to take a test. You had to become a citizen. Well, that certain amount of time is going to be raised under the alien laws. Now, by itself, that doesn't seem like such a bad idea. It's the intention behind it that's a little bit iffy, because remember, the Federalists are more of the upper class, and then the middle and lower classes are usually voting and supporting the Democratic Republicans. So the Federalists make this alien law. They want to stay in power. If you are somebody immigrating to the United States, most likely you're not coming here because your life was great. You're not going to upend your entire life because things were going swimmingly somewhere else, right? So a lot of the time they're middle to poorer classes. We're keeping them from being able to vote for longer. The sedition laws, those are really dicey, you guys. They make it a crime to impede the policies of the government or falsely defame its officials. Specifically, it's aimed at Democratic Republican newspaper editors. We're keeping them from publishing things. That's a violation of the First Amendment, you guys. They have freedom of the press, and we're saying you can't do it. So the Democratic Republicans, Madison and Jefferson specifically, are going to respond anonymously with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. One of the reasons Jefferson prefers to remain anonymous is because, remember, he's vice president right now. But in these resolutions, they argue that the states have the right to nullify laws. They're saying that the states should be able to nullify the alien and sedition laws. They use something called the compact theory to justify their position. The compact theory argues that the government was created by the states, so the states could choose whether the government's laws were constitutional. The Federalists counter-argue that the compact was made, but it was made by the people, not the states, so the states don't get to decide what's constitutional. We're actually going to talk at length next time about who really gets to decide what's constitutional, but it ends up not being the states. All right, so finally, we're going to have the Revolution of 1800. This one is a bloodless revolution, you guys. There's not going to be any actually fighting. Jefferson, though, is going to win the election of 1800. He ousts Adams from the presidency. So remember, when Washington left, he didn't get voted out of office, you guys. He didn't run for a third term. So this is the first time that two people have run against each other, and one of them was the sitting president. Why is that important? This is the first peaceful, orderly transition of power from one major party to another in the United States. This is so significant because Adams and the Federalists controlled the executive branch, and they also controlled Congress. Right? So we've got the executive branch, we've got Congress, the judicial branch was just kind of finding its feet, the Supreme Court and all that. So legislative, executive, they could have just stayed. They could have been like, nope, we've decided democracy doesn't work. It would have resulted in a really big war, but it would have resulted in the Constitution and the American experiment failing. But it doesn't. It works. Adams leaves and Jefferson comes in. So we're going to see next time what Jefferson does. Also, take a good long look at this picture. The more you look at it, the crazier it gets. All right, I'll see you guys next time.